Hello and welcome to China's DeepSeek Moment, a webinar series produced by Asia Society Policy Institute's Center for China Analysis. I am Lizzi C, a fellow here at CCA, and I'm delighted to be joined today by Professor Yasheng Huang of MIT. Our session is titled, Can China Become an Innovation Superpower? We will explore the forces shaping China's R&D ecosystem, from the role of Tsinghua University to the paradox of scale versus scope in innovation, as Professor Huang researched and write about in his book. We'll also talk about China's new wave of domestically born, US-trained entrepreneurs transforming its biotech industry. We'll also look at the implications of talent flows for US-China tech competition and also global scientific collaboration. So, Professor Huang, I want to begin with something that's close to both of us, MIT. You and I actually share a connection to this fantastic institution. Well, actually, many MIT graduate students, as you know, did their undergrad studies at what's often called the Chinese MIT, Tsinghua University. So, can you start by helping us understand a little better about Tsinghua and its role in China? How does it compare with the MIT here in the United States? And what does that comparison tell us more broadly about the differences between the US system and the Chinese system for cultivating talent and fostering innovation?
Yeah, thank you, Lizzie. First, let me just say briefly about this sort of DeepSeek moment. And that phrase is borrowed from the Sputnik moment in 1957 when the Soviet Union launched the man-made satellite into the space. But there's a fundamental basic difference between that event and the DeepSeek event. Satellite, that was really truly the first, because nobody else sent man-made object into the space, and the Soviet Union was the first country that did that. AI, that's not the same, right? As you know, DeepSeek was a product of optimization of existing foundational model, and it contributed to the efficiency, to the maybe the cost effectiveness of the AI language, large language model, but it's not the same as the Sputnik in a technical sense. So I know in the media, people talk about these two events as if they were similar, but there were some fundamental differences. And we can come back to that topic later. But let me answer the question that you just posed. So there's very well established evidence that the Chinese tertiary education at the undergraduate level is superb. Well, actually, let me put it this way. There's well-established evidence that the Chinese basic education, primary education, middle school education, up to the tertiary education is rigorous, especially in the engineering and technical fields, is much more rigorous than what we have in the West, in the United States. Whether tertiary education itself is the reason why there are so many talented undergraduate students coming from China, I think we can still have a debate about that. To some extent, good things go in, good things come out. Whether the tertiary education in China is the only reason why China has produced broad-based, deep talents in science and technology and engineering, at least I have some doubt, but we can study this issue further. Among the tertiary education institutions, Tsinghua is obviously the leading university in China. and Peking University is the other. But many of your viewers may not know, since the late 1990s, these two universities, Tsinghua and Peking University, basically have enjoyed a prior pick of their students. Essentially, they get to pick the applicants first ahead of the other universities. So essentially, there's a guaranteed channel to Tsinghua and to Peking University. That policy was instituted in the late 1990s. I'm not exactly sure whether or not the policy still applies today, but I know for decades that has been the practice. So that's a guaranteed source of their student quality, and there's no question that graduates from Tsinghua, from Peking University are among the top talents coming out of China. When you talk about graduate program, that's an entirely different story. And you may know this, but I don't really know of any systematic study of the graduate students being trained at Tsinghua, Peking University, whether or not they are comparable in terms of quality to their undergraduate student body. I suspect not. So if you look at the top talents in science and technology and engineering coming out of China, it is usually the combination of undergraduate education in China, not just at Tsinghua and Peking University, but also at other good universities in China, and graduate programs in the West. So this is a detail that, again, sometimes is missed in the broader discussion of this issue. So the way you think about this is that I think the Chinese tertiary education has been a feeder system channel to the likes of MIT, Stanford, Harvard, and the graduate programs in China, as far as I know, have not been as well developed as either the undergraduate program, and I would argue not even remotely close to the graduate programs at the best of the North American education institutions. I'm actually interested in hearing your view because you know a lot about this issue as well.
Yeah, I think, terrific point. I don't have sort of the general data on this, but at least in the AI sector, Macropolo, the think tank, actually had a flagship report examining the source of AI talent. I think one of the headline findings is actually, if you look at the talent flow, well, for China's domestic talents in AI, substantial part of them were educated, in China for their undergraduate degree. But when it comes to PhD degree, elite US institutions still their primary destination. And when it comes to their professional careers, the top talents definitely hone their skill and professional network in leading US AI companies and also, big tech companies in Silicon Valley, basically.
Yeah.
So I think that really kind of speaks to a typical career trajectory of a Chinese talent. I think this will be more clear as we talk about the biotech sector later on,
Yeah.
which we can go into more details. But related to the difference.
Lizzi, let me just insert one short
Sure.
comment, a footnote to what you just said. One would expect that the AI to be this true of that dichotomy.
Mhm.
And yet it is true, as you pointed out, that still the top talents at the graduate level, so far at least, have come from North American graduate programs. I would argue that if there's one area where the domestic Chinese educational system can produce top level talent, it would have been the AI
Mhm.
area. So if it is still true in the AI area, it is even more true of the other areas. So I think it's really important that we I have a forthcoming book, which is all about the details. Getting the details right about China is incredibly important in terms of getting the big picture right about China.
Absolutely. And speaking of this university, sort of dichotomy that we just talked about, I do wonder, what do you make of China's recent push to expand its universities? For example, we see kind of new campuses in Hangzhou or Shenzhen, expansion of their flagship public universities, big STEM universities, to be closer to the tech sector. Does that kind of, geographical proximity help foster a more integrated R&D innovation system like Silicon Valley? In other words, I guess another way to put it is, can China not only have an MIT, but also Stanford? Or is the geographic proximity simply just an artificial, construct, so to speak?
Well, no, geography is not an artificial construct; it's a real construct. Um, it's not surprising that Kendall Square now is the home of the biotech boom, biotech technology. It's not surprising that Stanford is the home of computer science, data, and software. Right. So geography is the key. And China, to some extent, already has that. Zhejiang University is located in a most entrepreneurial province in China, and it has this combination of an excellent university and the entrepreneurial ecosystem, and probably some finance as well, right? So when you think about how, I just think that worldwide you get technological innovation successes in the same way. It's a combination of knowledge, human capital, and entrepreneurship. Right? So you need to have these three pillars as critical factors. And Zhejiang has all three of them. Beijing probably has two, human capital and financial capital. And arguably, Shenzhen, one area where Shenzhen traditionally is lacking is the university. A few years back, I forgot when it was established, but the Southern University of Science and Technology was established to specifically address that shortcoming. And that university has become very, very powerful. And in terms of its ranking, it has also risen in terms of the ranking. But interestingly, as I'm relatively familiar with the history of that university, the university was founded specifically to be a little bit outside of the traditional establishment system. But over the years, and let me be specific, over the last 13 years, it has been incorporated back into the traditional Ministry of Education system. So to me, what is important is definitely geography, but what's also important to me is the political geography, right? So, how far away you are from the kind of the political central planning control. Zhejiang is far away, and that's why you witness so many success stories in Zhejiang. Shenzhen traditionally has been far away, and that's why you also witness entrepreneurial success stories in Shenzhen. And by the way, one region that has a lot of human capital and financial capital that doesn't have an impressive record of entrepreneurship is Shanghai, right? and this is counterintuitive because traditionally in the 1920s and 1930s, Shanghai was a bastion of Chinese entrepreneurship. But the reason is very simple. Shanghai has very close geographic connection, political connection to the central government. and that's not a, even though Shanghai has impressive financial capital, human capital, but that's not a success formula for technological entrepreneurship. And what Shanghai is good at is, so we'll probably get into this discussion, scaling existing technology.
Yeah.
Right? Look at Tesla, right? And in the 1990s, it was GM, and 1980s, it was Volkswagen. It is very good at scaling, but it doesn't have this scope conditions that Shenzhen has and Zhejiang has.
Yeah, super interesting, and really appreciate you unpacking the regional differences for us. Back to your broader point of this, the importance of resisting broader narratives about China and getting the details right. I think for many years, China was dismissed as a copycat economy, and now I think we can safely say that that conversation has shifted. China can innovate, but it does so very differently. And as you mentioned, I think we see this most clearly in AI, but also in things like EV, right? The United States actually pioneered the underlying inventions, but China has excelled at scaling, deploying, and kind of building industries around them. This actually brings me to your book. In your book, The Rise and Fall of the East, by the way, highly recommend to our audience, you discuss the granular details of the exam system Keji and autocracy and how that system fosters stability and scaling, but potentially at the cost of creative scope, as you alluded to just now. What actually strikes me as super interesting in your book is that you distinguish between different types of scaling. I wonder if you can unpack that for our audience a little more.
So copycat is copycat, right? So you do A, I do exactly A. You produce T-shirt, I produce T-shirt. I don't think China has moved away from being also very good in copycat, right? Producing exact replicas of products. I mean, that's, sometimes people have a negative view of copycat, but another way of looking at the copycat is not just that you're able to produce exactly the same products as another person, another company, but produce it at the same level of quality, at a very high yield, to the same specifications. There's a fundamental difference between producing a T-shirt that looks exactly like another T-shirt and producing a T-shirt that also looks like another T-shirt but only lasts one day. Right? So what China is incredibly good is being able to produce on massive scale at very high quality and at low cost. It is not just simply a literary copy of another product. So we should give credit to this term copycat, to this success that China has achieved. And by the way, that achievement is by no means trivia. Sometimes people have, you got a degree from MIT, I got a degree from also a pretty good university. Sometimes we have kind of a dismissive attitude toward copycat and arguing, oh, that's because China has low cost. There are many, many countries, as you know from your econ background, many countries have low cost. But how many countries can replicate the manufacturing capacity that China has, right? So I actually think that this is not a trivia achievement that China has accomplished. This is actually remarkable, and I do trace that to the Keji system, the exam system, and the exam system is designed to replicate. The other kind of scaling is scaling, but also optimization. some people call it innovation. I hesitate to use that term um, because this is a sort of optimization basically comes from learning from doing, right? So you have to do it in order to optimize. If you don't do it, you cannot optimize. That's fundamentally different from some of the scientific technological breakthroughs that we have seen, like just take the example of iPhone, right? Um, iPod, going back to the 2000s. It's hard to sort of argue that the iPhone was invented because you have been doing a lot of iPhones, right? I mean, by definition, it didn't exist. But once the iPhone was invented, it was primarily Foxconn, the Taiwanese company, that figured out how to produce this at a massive level and how to save costs, right? And I give a lot of credit to Foxconn. I gave a lot of credit to Apple, Steve Jobs, in inventing iPhone. But it is hard for me to say these two things are exactly equivalent, and therefore we use the same term to describe them, right? Because Foxconn is able to improve its production because iPhone already existed, right? Whereas Apple invented the iPhone, so it's sort of truly 0 to 1. And again, I don't mean to say that one is better than the other. You need both. But the question is, if you don't have one, can you have 100, right? And so if you already have iPhone, then it becomes a question of the necessity being the mother of the innovation and invention. You really need to innovate the way you manufacture. And I would say the same thing about Japan, right? Toyota, and they invented the zero inventory system, which is really remarkable improvement of the production process. But suppose you didn't even have a car in the first place. So I think we as academics tend to get into these issues. I don't really see a lot of that nuances in the media coverage. They kind of lump all these things together. And the biotech, we can get into that later. I agree with you. We truly see some potential breakthroughs coming out of China, and then we can have a debate how that came about. But so far I don't see it in the EV space. In terms of this innovation concept that is commonly deployed, I don't see it in the AI space. And if you look at the EV space, the battery, I don't know if you know about this company coming out of MIT, A123 System, that was founded in 2001, right? Way ahead of the battery production and scaling in China. I think that is a different discussion. The discussion about and the solar panels. President Jimmy Carter installed solar panels on the roofs of the White House. Okay, so that was in 1976. So the discussion there is not loosely about China being innovative in solar panels, being innovative in battery. Clearly, China didn't invent these technologies. I think the larger story there is the utter failure on the part of the United States to scale the technologies that the United States invented. That is a bigger story. And if we don't examine that history, and instead we sort of come up with this notion, oh, China is so innovative, look at the EVs, look at the battery. I think we get the whole history wrong and we draw the wrong lessons, right?
Absolutely.
And look at what happened to the solar panels. President Ronald Reagan, as soon as he became the president, he took down the solar panels. Just imagine that the United States was able to scale solar panels in 1980. Will the world look the same today as it actually does? I would argue not, right? So I think to me, this is, as academics, as journalists, that's the issue we need to explore. You know, what is it that we fail? A1, 2, 3, we fail in terms of scaling, in terms of converting the technologies into production, into manufacturing.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, so that's the critical issue.
Yeah, the way, I mean, I think one of the major contribution of your book, as I read it, is you discussed how the scale advantage is institutionalized in China, building from its history. And for China, I think the shortcoming is the culture of scope or diversity of ideas has never been institutionalized in a deep way. So we see these, bright spots like biotech, which we will turn to later. But I think fundamentally, the institutionalized part of China's advantage is still very much embedded in scale. And I would argue for the United States, kind of the opposite. The culture of embracing uncertainty and serendipity, embracing frontier diversity of ideas is more institutionalized in the American system. But the culture of scale, as you correctly mentioned, is sometimes looked down upon, if anything. So
Yeah.
that part is missing. But I do think there is a missing piece of the puzzle in our intellectual inquiry as a researcher now and as a former journalist to kind of trace that back to the history, the origin story of the United States, why the United States has not been able to institutionalize the culture of scaling. I think, now we see some reckonings from policymaking community, from researching community, and also from academics on the United States actually needs a kind of balance this institution more towards industrial, reshoring, so to speak, or boosting Americans' industrial base. But again, like I invite you to brainstorm with me and also with our audience on how to get that piece right. I absolutely agree that that piece is still very much missing in our public discourse discussions.
Yeah. So I think it's both culture and maybe three things, right? Both culture, institution, and policy.
Yeah.
And in the U.S., we have almost negative culture about scaling, right? So just go back and read the book by Peter Thiel, From Zero to One. That's a very Silicon Valley way of looking at things. 0 to 1 is celebrated. 1 to 100, 1 to that's just copycat, right? So just the way that term copycat is used, it has very negative connotation, right? And I just think that culture is terribly destructive, and also economically stupid, right? Because you don't reap profits from invention. You reap economic benefits from scaling, from converting technologies into production, into manufacturing, into commercial development, right? So we have powerful research institutions, MIT, Stanford, etc. Recently, I published a piece in Nature magazine comparing the endowment size of 10 top universities it turns out to be something in the neighborhood of $271 billion. That is smaller than $450 billion of one individual, Elon Musk. The reason is that the research universities supply knowledge to the public and then waiting for others to commercialize and to convert knowledge into production, into commercial development. Then the question is, who is going to do that?
Yeah.
Some areas, companies are very, very good at doing that, and they have the incentive to do that. But our culture is not organized to privilege that part of the economic development, right? So, we worship entrepreneurs, and we tend to think about entrepreneurs as good because they break things, right? Rather than build things. They're good because they can break the establishment system. So we have this kind of antithetical attitude toward bigness, right? IBM was viewed as bureaucracy, autocratic. Apple, when it was a small company, was viewed as heroic and rebellious. So I think I'm not saying that culture is completely wrong, but we do need to have a more balanced view of that culture. In terms of institutions, we rely on private capital, and in certain areas, private capital is extremely available, right? So if you look at the venture capital space, in the US, the venture capital space has gone to essentially two areas, biotech and computer science. Okay, so those two areas are not short of private capital. But what about mechanical engineering? What about material science, right? What about these other areas that are in between? Private capital is not that forthcoming. And then the policy. So as you know, you got a PhD degree in economics, and for years and years, the economists had a very negative view toward industrial policy, toward government support. And the other day, I went to a seminar, and the person who gave the seminar told us that during the 2008 financial crisis, when the government rescued the auto industry, the government did not make any requirement on the recipient companies to source from domestic electric battery companies. Like, when I bail out, yet I didn't even require you to source from. At that time, 2008, the US had a leading edge in battery. And as you know, some of these scaling is a sort of a chicken egg issue, right? So if you don't have chicken, you don't have egg. If you don't have egg, you don't have chicken. You need something that can jumpstart this process. The government and government policy have failed to play even a minimum role in jumping start this process. So on all three levels, culture, institution, private financial institutions, and government policy, we are not well organized to scale. And now with the current administration, we're moving even further away from these rather than trying to solve these problems.
Right. Well, thank you so much for that perspective. But as we discussed, biotech seems to be a surprising bright spot, or the exception that proves the rule, so to speak, when it comes to China's source of strength, when it comes to innovation versus loosely defined innovation. So I wanted to turn to the biotech sector. as you mentioned, we're now seeing genuine innovation in this sector in China, from first in class and best in class biotech assets to the surge in high quality research publications, not just duplicate low quality publications. So, what explains China's success in this sector? What's happening in China's biotech ecosystem that has allowed it to break the mold compared with other industries?
So, Lizzie, I hesitate to
Mhm.
say this is the exception that proves the rule.
All right.
So let's be clear about what the rule is, and then think about whether or not this is an exception. The rule, from my point of view, worldwide, and now I'm doing project on Chinese history of technology. So going back to history, the generalized rule, maybe not the rule, but the generalized pattern is that innovations tend to happen when you have a number of factors in place. Scaling, right? So we can think about finance as a way to scale. In the US, AI, biotech, they got a lot of finance, so there's that scaling. In EVs and in battery, they didn't get scaling support either from private sector or from the government sector, and therefore they didn't develop in the same way. And scope, right? So in my book, I contrast these two conditions, scale conditions and scope conditions. Scope conditions are about the willingness to take risks and to think big and think different. But how do you get that attitude and the habit of thinking big, thinking different, and being willing to take risks? You get that by being exposed to different ideas, different cultures, different attitudes. So in one chapter of my East book, I talk about globalization of Chinese educational institutions as a way to introduce scope conditions. As we know, as you know, and anybody who is familiar with China knows, China has not implemented educational reform. Universities are controlled by the Ministry of Education, and the curriculum is top-down rather than bottom-up. The faculty recruitment and faculty supervision of PhD students, a lot of those are bureaucratic rather than intellectual. But there's one area where that system is the least relevant, and that's in the area of globalizing the educational system. Chinese professors, Chinese students come to the US, come to other countries to conduct joint research programs and to collaborate with each other, write papers together, do experiments together. The way that I frame this development in my book is that this is almost like importing diversity into a educational system that has the scale conditions but doesn't have the scope conditions by itself. And in fact, in the educational arena, it is a very good illustration of the combination of the scale conditions. China spent a lot of money on its university. And I can tell you that in the past, when US-China relationship was good, quite a few universities sought out collaborations with Chinese universities because they couldn't get enough federal funding for their research projects. Whereas China is the only developing country that spends more than 2% of the GDP on R&D. Usually, you have to be a developed country to spend this high proportion of the GDP on R&D. China was the only country that participated in the Human Genome Project in the world. No other developing country was a part of it. And as you pointed out, Chinese professors and Chinese scientists write papers for top level publications. And another area where China got scope condition in this ecosystem. No matter what you think about Chinese state, it is the least controlling of science and technology. It is very controlling of social science. And the scope conditions there today are almost non-existent. Before the, as you know from the econ program you went through, in the past, economics among the social science topics had some freedom, right? And that's why I believe that China produced some very good economists. But in other areas of social science, law, sociology, and political science, the control was incredibly tight. Now, even economics, the control is very tight. Do you witness a large group of top-level social scientists coming out of China? The answer is no. Right? Even on China topics, even papers on China itself. And some papers are good, but usually they are co-authored with Western authors. Vast majority of the papers in social science, especially published in Chinese journals, are not of high quality. The books are not of high quality. So it doesn't violate the general pattern that we observe, and I try to establish in the book, which is that you need both the scale and scope to succeed. In science and technology, China had a scale, they supported R&D, but they also have scope. One, through importing foreign education. When you conduct research at MIT, even as a Chinese professor, essentially you operate under the Western environment, right? You can think big, think free, you can take risks. So the way I put it is that by globalization of the educational system, China outsourced this scope condition to foreign countries.
Yeah.
So you get one scope condition there, and the other scope condition is by policy. Recall was it 2018 when the Chinese scientists genetically edited the HIV gene of a Chinese mother, right? But there's no way that at that time you could do this in the United States, right? In the United States now, there's very stringent control over human subject trials, and whereas in China, you could actually carry that freedom quite far. So I don't see that as a violation, as an exception to the rule. In fact, it is quite consistent with the general pattern, which is that when you have successes, it is because of a combination of scale and scope.
Yeah. Absolutely. Well, thank you for that. And speaking of this idea of globalization of ideas, globalization of science foundation, I also wanted to talk a little bit about globalization of talent flow. In your book, you have this fascinating term, the new Argonauts, which refers to, when it comes to the biotech sector, China-born, US-trained innovators who kind of cut their teeth in American higher graduate education system, and also in American big pharma, before returning to China to build China's domestic biotech powerhouse. Just to be more concrete, can you tell us a little more about who these new Argonauts are, how they operate, and what makes them such an important force in China's biotech boom?
Yeah, so I meant to talk about biotech in my last comment. So let me come back to this. Does the biotech innovation that is coming out of China is an exception to the rule? I would argue it is part of the rule, right? These are Western educated, almost all of them US educated, I believe. And they are startups or backed by American venture capital funds. Many of them has a prior work experience in the big farmer, usually Western farmer rather than Chinese farmer. And by the way, one interesting dichotomy is that China now has some really very compelling biotech companies. It has yet to have very compelling pharmaceutical players. I don't claim to understand that dichotomy, but I think it is worth thinking and exploring why this is the case. So we actually see this phenomenon worldwide. In India, the software takeoff was by Indian software engineers who were trained in the West, who worked in the IBM, in the Microsoft, and then they left these MNCs to start their own companies, and they jump-started the software outsourcing business in India. The Tata Consulting, Infosys. It's the same, exactly the same story everywhere. So that's number one. Number two, unlike other areas, the Chinese government, so this is where the scale condition played a role. This is one area where the government began to recruit human capital from abroad very early on. You may remember in the early 2000s and late 1990s, actually even in the 1980s, the highest exam, the people who scored the highest on Gaokao, on the college exam, were biologists. So the Peking University biology department had the highest GPAs. And then in the 2000s, unfortunately, it degenerated to the MBA. So, but that's like finance and things like that. So Tsinghua, for example, for some years, it was their business school that had the highest GPAs. But for many, many years, biology was viewed as the field that attracted the top talents. And in fact, China, for a period of time, had an oversupply of biological talent. So it had that scale condition. And then in the 2000s, Chinese government began to recruit from abroad the bio talents, not so much to the universities per se, but to the entrepreneurial space, gave them good policies and subsidies and all of that. So in my book, I listed some data, but I cannot remember precisely the data points. Beginning in 2004, so we're talking about 20 years, more than 20 years ago, the biotech in life science, that was one area where you began to see Chinese students to return to China more than other fields, right? More than physics, more than mathematics, and more than definitely more than finance and business school. There was an association of biotech entrepreneurs in California. That association may still exist. The members are mostly Chinese American bioscientists. So they have like different branches, right? Shanghai, Beijing, and then San Francisco. I think by 2014, majority of their members resided in China. So this is one area where the global talent went back to China the earliest. So this is where, again, I'm so frustrated with media because they don't get into these details. They view the biotech success as a example of look at what Xi Jinping is doing, So and the industrial policy and all of. No, I'm not going to say this is not a factor, but what I'm trying to say is that this is a long process that began to accumulate more than 20 years ago, right? So if you look at the biotech cycles, it takes about 20 years to go from, maybe a startup to coming out with truly new molecules. And then the next phase is clinical trials and mass production.
Yeah.
So the next test is going to be, so this is going to be interesting. So some of the true biotech products were invented in China. Are they going to be scaled in China?
Absolutely. I think you just hit the nail on the head. In fact, this is one of the projects that I'm currently researching on. Again, I think it's too preliminary to present to our audience our findings, but what we are focusing on is how the ecosystem required for a pharmaceutical company to be successful is fundamentally different from the ecosystem that's required for a biotech company to be innovative. For example, China theoretically has a large market for pharmaceutical company, but because of the domestic reimbursement system, so because of the national insurance system, artificially lowered down its price. So if you want to access the market, you have to make substantial price concessions. So that makes it extremely unprofitable for pharmaceutical companies operating in China, and that they have to get access to the global market, which is part of the reason why they have to, why they want to deal with American pharmaceutical companies to make up for that domestic gap. And also, for pharmaceutical companies to be successful, you don't just need innovation, you also need credibility on a regulatory standard, credibility of clinical trial data, cross-border legal expertise, sales expertise, marketing expertise. There's a much more complicated ecosystem. And that's actually a central part of our research agenda from the Center for China.
That's great. I think it's great that you are doing this detailed dive into this phenomenon and try to shy away from this kind of grand narrative. One of the things that your viewers may know or may not know is that the typical exit option for biotech is through the pharmaceutical production rather than getting listed on the stock market. And that option is there, but the main conventional way is through the pharmaceutical channel. When you don't have this pharmaceutical capability downstream, that limits your upside option from exit. And this is why so many Chinese biotech companies want to come abroad.
Absolutely.
And so this sits uncomfortably with this narrative that China has become a fertile ground for pharmaceutical industry, but the profitability dynamic works very, very differently in this industry. Whereas Alibaba, Tencent and Baidu, their downstream is almost entirely in China. So they can take their companies abroad and list them in Hong Kong and in the United States because their customer base is in China. In the pharmaceutical area, you can have a large customer base in China because China has a big population, so there are a lot of patients. But this intermediate step, China is missing in this intermediate step. So if you are a biotech company, your customer base in China, but this intermediate step is outside of China, what do you do, right? So that will be a very interesting development to see. And I worry that the Chinese government, in its infinite wisdom, is going to one day impose restrictions on Chinese biotech companies in terms of their ability to connect with the downstream American and Western pharmaceutical companies. That will not be very good for the pharmaceutical product development. And by the way, the US is trying to do the same thing now, right? Biosafety Act is, I don't know if it has been passed, but at least it has been proposed to cut off the relationship between the pharmaceutical companies in the West with the Chinese biotech companies in China. And that has motivated some of the Chinese biotech companies to be to register their businesses outside of China in order to get away from that restriction.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you're absolutely right to point out to the danger of US-China decoupling when it comes to this area. Unfortunately, I think we're seeing some policy signals from both sides, right? As you mentioned, from the United States side, President Trump's proposed 100% tariffs on the medical sector, and the new executive order banning US pharma from dealing with Chinese biotech firms, and also the Biosecure Act, which is currently in Congress, but also likely to be very detrimental to collaboration between Chinese biotech and also US pharma. Speaking of policy, I also wanted to turn to the final piece, which is immigration. I think this is also something that we are focusing on, but we are also seeing this interesting contrast, if you will. The United States is tightening its H-1B visa. On the other hand, China seems to be embracing global talent with open arms. And I think that contrast is really concerning from my point of view, who's, who thinks that the immigration system, the talent inflow, is actually one of the key strengths of United States sustaining source of power and brilliance and innovation. I think, with the launch of the K visa program and this renewed effort to recruit global talents and business officials and workers, we are seeing this difference in stance when it comes to immigration. And that brings me to a big picture question. Your book highlights the Tang Dynasty, this very special moment for China, a period of not just, economic strength, but also talent attraction, cultural vitality, and innovation. If anything, I think politically speaking, China today seems more insular and tightly controlled, more security first versus economic first. But with this new effort to recruit global talent, to attract global talents to China, do you see China as potentially stepping closer to a Tang Dynasty style renaissance? Or do you think if the current atmosphere is still too restrictive for that vision to materialize?
Yeah, so I view the current approach, the K visa and 1,000 talent program, for example, more as a company HR policy rather than the Tang Dynasty policies probably not the right word, but because the imperial system didn't really have an intentional policy, but just a feature of that time, which was openness, cosmopolitan, and non-restrictive. So China has a more today. The talent program is very well defined, right? So in this area, we have these talent programs, and we discourage the other areas. I think you as an economist and me as a sort of institutional political economist, I don't think we are welcome in China. And if you go to law school, I don't think you would be welcomed into China. I don't think they have a 1,000 talent program for people like that, right? So it is, to me, this is a human resource program designed to solve some specific problems, at least their conception of specific problems, rather than genuine openness and cosmopolitan. And it is similar to H1B in that regard. H1B is a HR, human resource program. But remember, though, the United States has H1B program in a broader context of openness, rule of law, academic freedom, and competitive labor market. So essentially, you have a very specific, tailor-made HR program in combination with these institutional features of the system. Whereas China has institution closure, lack of openness, and now they roll out this specific HR program. Whether or not that's going to work, I don't know, but my prediction is that when you have that combination, it is unlikely to attract truly top-level human capital, right? So essentially, you probably have some specific skills to contribute, and the program rewards you for that contribution, and you take the K visa. But if you think about some of the entrepreneurs that succeeded in the United States, they also came through the H1B program. They came through H1B program. Elon Musk being the most famous, there could be others. So he took advantage not of just a company human resource program, but he took advantage of the broader parameters and the conditions of the system, and he succeeded. But now he's on the other side. He's against it. So, but that's a complicated story. But I think the worry that I have about the United States is that under this administration, where we are going back against rule of law, we're going back against free media, and then we're weakening this human resource program. I just don't think that's a good combination, and I think that's, we may not know the effects of these developments because these things take time, but I cannot think of any upside scenario that these developments are going to be good for the U.S. economy, are going to be good for the U.S. science and technology.
Yeah, important word of warning at the very end for our policymakers. Well, Professor Huang, thank you so much for sharing your insights with me today. And thank you to our audience for joining us in this episode of China's DeepSeek moment. But as Professor Huang points out, the DeepSeek moment, well, we should take that with a grain of salt. But we will continue exploring the forces shaping China's innovation and also tech landscape, weeks and months ahead. Until next time, I'm Lizzi C with Asia Society Policy Institute's Center for China Analysis. See you next time.